Welcome to Divisionalysis. I'm Fog. It's a 3,000 subscriber special, and I've got a very good one for you. It is the TU20 updated weapon rankings episode, but in combination with that, I am going to drop a fact about damage in this game, a new principle that will have you questioning everything that you thought you knew about damage in this game and everything that you've been told. Hope you're ready. Grab the popcorn, strap in, let's go. Now, given the surprises that I've discovered throughout this process, rather than just giving you the results, which are going to be hard to understand, I've got to admit, without context and how I've come up with those results, this process of establishing what is the best weapon system has taken me over a year to develop and get all of the data necessary in order to do this as accurately as I think is possible. So I'm going to go through the process from start to finish to understand where we finish up. So we start with this sheet here. So this is, I'm sure, everybody has seen one of these before. So this is updated for TU20 with the base damage, the new RPMs for some of the weapons, new mag sizes, the advertised reload speed, and then some calculations at the back of that, which are your total magazine damage, and then the what I call like old calculations, because I use different ones, but the old calculations for burst damage per second and sustained damage per second. Now, if I was to just simply convert those burst DPS and sustained DPS results into a simple graph, this is what you get for burst DPS with the big horn out in front. And then when we go to sustained DPS, then this is what we get. The bighorn drops just slightly behind the eagle bearer for total damage output. Now, I have explained over more than a year now the issues that I have with the burst DPS calculation, and also some of the issues that I've got with sustained DPS, but far less. So if we look at the burst DPS calculation, we're told that the calculation is total magazine damage divided by the time to fire that magazine. Now this gives you the false impression that the total magazine damage is in fact included as part of this equation, and that it factors in how many rounds are in the magazine. But that is a completely false impression. If you actually look into it, total magazine damage is divided into the bullet damage times the number of rounds in the magazine, and then time to fire the magazine is the number of rounds in the magazine over the weapon's rounds per second. Now, simple algebra will tell you that you can actually eliminate both of the number of rounds in the magazine, completely obliterating that piece of data, and what you end up with is bullet damage times round per second. And that's completely acceptable as another way to work out burst DPS, and that's the reason why. Both of those equations, whether it's bullet damage times rounds per second or total magazine damage divided by time to fire magazine, will always give you exactly the same result. So the number of rounds in the magazine are completely ignored. On top of that, this is only for when the weapon is firing. It completely ignores anything to do with reloads and reload speed. With sustained DPS, at least it considers both of those and doesn't obliterate any of those pieces of very important data. So you have total magazine damage over the time to fire the magazine plus the time to reload. You cannot destroy any piece of data because you need to add time to fire magazine and time to reload before conducting the end calculation. So in my mind, if you are going to use either of these equations, you will understand damage relationships far better by using sustained DPS as your primary calculation method. Now, to be honest, this calculation for in-game play is actually horrifically inaccurate, but that is something that I'm going to explain a little bit later. I'm going to introduce a new damage principle which will explain why I have altered this equation for my metrics. But that new damage principle will completely turn your world on its head when it comes to damage, and you will question everything that you think that you know about this game. But that's for a little bit later on. We're just going to stick with going through the process for now. Now, in order to calculate bullet damage, because in both of these cases you need to understand the bullet damage, to work out your total magazine damage, or to multiply it by rounds per second for burst DPS. My very first video ever was explaining how you can work out bullet damage. When you actually do that, you work out that even on a very simple build, you will have 16 different damage numbers. And that's on a build without any stacking mechanics, and that is reliant on you being within the optimal range of that weapon in order to produce just 16 different numbers. So it's incredibly important to understand how often each one of these numbers occurs to work out what your actual bullet damage is. I went through a couple of these factors in my next video, calculating DPS using the old calculations, and explaining how the rate of occurrence for each one of these different numbers will tell you what your average bullet damage is, so you can input that into either your burst DPS calculation or your sustained DPS calculation. Now, the issue is working out all of the factors that affect your bullet damage and what rate they occur. So these are all of the things that will modify your weapon damage. And then we have these things which will impact the rate at which those damage numbers occur. If you want to have an accurate reflection of in-game performance and to have an accurate methodology for comparing weapons, you need to either eliminate or account for every one of these factors. So in order to work out the rates at which some of these damage numbers will occur, I went through in my DPS Truths video, and every mission I ran it 3 times over, collecting all of the stats that I possibly could in regards to those rates of occurrence and what the enemy type was. I've recently updated those enemy type videos to give you an armor to health ratio and total health points for all of the enemies that we're going to face when we're playing this game. In order to eliminate some of those variables, I created a test build. The test build has a brand set bonus from every single weapon type: shotguns, SMGs, LMGs, assault rifles, and rifles, meaning that any weapon that we test on this build is going to be given the equal amount of weapon damage. I can also change the mods accordingly, or I can change from Grupo to Seska depending on what the crit chance, and give every build and every weapon type an equal opportunity on this build. And it provides an equal platform by removing total weapon and amplified damage talents, all of which will make an equal difference regardless of the weapon type that's actually being compared. For instance, a 100% strikers bonus will provide 100% amplified damage to any weapon that we equip. So including those bonuses is not necessary, and it means that we can eliminate them from the process. Burst DPS calculation, that very first graph that I showed you, the only 2 factors that are actually considered are weapon-based damage and the rate of fire of the weapon. Remembering it was damage times rounds per second. That was it. That was the only factors out of this entire sheet that were actually considered. With a test build, we have a build now that eliminates weapon talents, gear talents, specialization talents, and that also removes our uptime as a factor. And we have consistency when it comes to our all weapon damage and specific weapon damage. The build, however, allows us to account for weapon type and attribute and the weapon attachments, because these will affect our damage producing numbers for crit hit damage, damage to targets out of cover, damage to armor, and damage to health. And TU20 is actually helped in this regard. There's far less mucking about because now damage to targets out of cover can be consistent across every single weapon. For burst DPS, we still include rate of fire. We're still missing magazine size and reload speed if we use a burst DPS calculation, but we can now eliminate RNG by averaging occurrence rates. Critical chance is also averaged. We don't have to worry about uptime on talents, and we can also account for the total health points, the armor and health distribution, and the target position, that being whether it's in cover or whether it's out of cover. Now, when you do all of that, your burst DPS table now looks like this. So you can see that there are definite shifts amongst the table when you account for those things. And this is in spite of the fact that TU20 brought some uniformity across the board, being that every weapon can now have damage to targets out of cover. The thing about the test build though is that it has the ability to provide uniform weapon damage regardless of the weapon type. And what that allows me to do for the remainder of this video and the remainder of these comparisons is to include another weapon system which a lot of people would be interested to see a comparison for, and that is the Ouroboros. And what you can see here, its burst DPS in comparison to all of the other assault rifles, or to all the assault rifles, it's considerably different. But remembering that we're not factoring in magazine size and reload speed. At least with a sustained DPS calculation, we can now factor those things in. When we do that, it is still the Ouroboros which leads the pack. Its reload speed is exceptionally good, but its time to fire its magazine is quite short, meaning that it is going to be in the state of reload or producing no damage for much greater period of time than the rest of these weapon systems. And that's why the gap is now narrowed. But there are still other factors that we need to account for. First I'm going to discuss is target distance. How far are we from our target and how that impacts our total damage output. When I ran all of the missions and collected all of the data, this is what that data looked like, and this is the number of engagements at any given distance throughout that mission. Outside of Washington and strongholds will generally have more enemies per mission than what the other missions do. So what we can do is we can normalize all of those results and we can put them on a 100% basis for the total mission, and we can smooth out those lines, and this is what we get. And what you can see, if you hadn't already seen that from the previous graph, is that there is a very distinct pattern that emerges. Now, I do not think that this is by accident. One, it is by design, but also I think that there is a mechanism that's built into the AI that actually results in this curve. What you can see here is a standard distribution curve. So if you were to flip a coin hundreds and hundreds of times, these are the results that would come out. Basically, this is the standard distribution for numbers of heads in a row or tails in a row, but it also applies to everything that's got a 50-50 chance or a completely random generated chance. And you can see when I overlay these two graphs, the correlation is virtually undeniable, and I actually believe that this is causation as to the reason why the graph looks like this. And if you look at this, if you've never seen one of these, this is called a Galton board, and the balls have a 50-50 chance of going either left or right when they hit one of these posts. And you can see that at the end, no matter how many times it's flipped, that the distribution of the results is uniform in that it is the standard distribution curve that we saw just before. And I believe that the AI is programmed on RNG, and so they will take either a left turn, a right turn, a forward movement, a rearward movement, based on a number of different characteristics, but what that results in is the distribution across the map that we see almost uniformly every single mission and every single wave that we encounter. Now that has an effect on damage output, based on a couple of factors, but first and foremost in this video I explained about optimal range. Now I've updated the optimal range figures for TU20, and this is the graph that is produced. So we have new base damage levels for majority of the weapons, but their floor or their base that they reach with optimal range is the same, which means that their optimal range drop-off has slightly increased as a percentage. But the important thing to note is that if I compare the St. Elmo's and I compare the Eagle Bearer here, if you look at the stats sheet, you're seeing exactly the same thing. But that's not the case. If I put them side by side or on top of each other in this graph and just isolate them, what you can see is that although that their optimal range drop-off starts at the same and their optimal range floor finishes at the same meterage, the base level that they start at and the end level that they finish at is different, and so therefore their optimal range drop-off is considerably different. And when we put them on a chart here, what you can see is the difference over the engagement ranges that we're going to achieve in game. And if I now add in the Ouroboros, what you can see is that the optimal range, although it doesn't affect the assault rifles very much. For a weapon system like the Ouroboros, or indeed the Chameleon, which is a vector base, or any SMG, the engagement ranges will significantly impact the damage output for those weapon systems. And so we have to account for those engagement distances. We then have rounds on target. Now, I can't account for your individual ability to land rounds on target. What I can do, however, and what I established during this weapon damage series on weapon handling, is a way to quantify the weapon's ability to land rounds on target. As a simple demonstration, the Honey Badger, the FAMAS, and the G36, we have the accuracy or the bloom of that weapon, and the weapon is also programmed with a movement of left to right when we're firing, and also up and down, or the recoil, when we're firing as well. Whether you're on controller or mouse, we're actually very good at controlling the vertical path of a weapon system. I think on a mouse it's easier, but it is possible to achieve the same results on both controller and mouse for vertical movement. Horizontal movement at the same time as vertical movement becomes more difficult on a controller. And those weapon systems with a more erratic left to right path and a more dramatic vertical movement are much harder to control on a controller. But what you end up with is an accuracy bloom that you have no control over as a human, but you then control both the X and the Y axis with reasonable degree of control. And that results in a distribution on the target for that weapon system. The G36 has a worse accuracy, making the bloom wider, more dispersed. The FAMAS has a more difficult to control weapon path, making an elliptical shape to its distribution, and the Honey Badger is both stable and accurate, meaning that you get a tight grouping from your distribution. And when you plot out all of the weapons, what you get is distribution paths, or what I call probability clouds, for each of the weapon systems that looks like this. Now what you can do from that is overlay that on a target at certain distances, and then calculate how much of that probability cloud now lands outside of the target, independent of how well you can control that weapon system. Anytime that the probability cloud starts to extend beyond the width of the target, you will see a dramatic drop-off in the number of rounds landed, because we're now talking about the area of a circle. And every single weapon system has a point where it will start to dramatically drop off as far as what you are physically capable of landing rounds onto target with. Now, as you can see here, for the majority of the assault rifles, that doesn't start to occur until we're out around the 45 meter mark. But for the Chameleon in blue and the Ouroboros in red, that drop-off starts to happen considerably sooner, because the bloom of the weapon starts to exceed the size of the target at those ranges. We then have to factor in how that accuracy and the weapon's ability now affects our ability to land headshots. Now, because headshots combine with critical headshots, you do receive a greater amount of diminished output or diminished return from a headshot than you do some of the other damage number types. And overall, between non-crits and crits, you end up with around about a 40% improvement on your damage output by consistently hitting headshots. The problem is consistently hitting headshots. When you are talking about a much smaller target, what you end up with, a drop-off much, much sooner, where the bloom of the weapon exceeds the width of the head much, much sooner. And that drop-off is quite dramatic. And this red line here, where we go from achieving 40% over our standard bullet damage by getting headshots, at this red line here, you are now dropping below what you would have got if you'd just gone for 100% body shots. And so there is a tipping point where you are it is no longer advantageous for a weapon to now go for headshots. And what you can see here is that distance for the Ouroboros is now less than 10 meters. And even at the 5 meter mark, you are now missing shots. No matter how close I get to the target, if it's at 5 meters, it is unavoidable for this weapon system to be already missing shots. Now all we have to do is now combine all of that data. We have our headshot damage, we have our optimal range, and we have our accuracy drop-off over distance. And when you combine all of that data, you get a distribution that looks like this. All of the assault rifles producing a varied but relatively similar distribution pattern, and only the two SMG platforms, being the Chameleon and the Ouroboros, with distinctly lower results. And what you can see is that the Ouroboros is in fact only producing 10% of its output at 50 meters. And by way of demonstration, here it is in the range. You can see the results for at 5 meters. And when we move to the 50 meter mark, we're actually producing less than 10% of the overall output we were at 5 meters. And that's because the weapon system now has to reload as well. But this is based on 100% of the individual weapon system's output. We still need to account for the actual damage produced by each one of these weapon systems. Now, in order to do that, there are a number of factors that I think need to be addressed. So first of all, we have burst DPS and sustained DPS. If I use the FAMAS as an example, what we have is a very high burst DPS, and if we convert that to sustained DPS, you can see a considerable drop for the FAMAS, and this is a result of its reload speed from empty. Because the FAMAS has a short duration of damage, as far as its ability to output that burst DPS, at 900 rounds, only 3.33 seconds, and because of its slow reload from empty, that means that it is reloading or doing no damage for a considerably greater percentage of its time than some of the other weapon systems. But this is a poor representation of the FAMAS. If we take the stats sheet, it says that its reload is 2.2 seconds. So I've investigated reloads in depth. And along with discovering that the majority of advertised reload speeds are incorrect, I've also discovered that there is a difference between reloading from empty and that time, and reloading from not empty or with rounds left in the magazine and that time. So when a FAMAS is doing burst DPS, the reload time is considerably reduced. Actually, the FAMAS has one of the best TAC reloads, or reloading not from empty, so accounting for that is incredibly important. So we need to add TAC reloads into our burst DPS method. And this isn't just important for the FAMAS, it's important for every single weapon to understand what the TAC reload does for its ability to burst fire, and then back it up with more burst firing after conducting a TAC reload. So with my metrics, the very first difference, and one of the largest ones, is that instead of using burst DPS, which does not account for duration of damage that the weapon can burst for, and doesn't account for the downtime of the weapon, so instead of burst DPS, I have what I call single target DPS. Now I use what I consider to be a reasonable number of enemies, being 6, which I think is reasonable for heroic level, because we start with 5 or 6 on the pitch to start with, and then they're depleted in number down to about 2 or 3, and they're reinforced with another 4, taking you back up to around 6 enemies. So it seemed reasonable for me to assume that 6 enemies was a good representative number of targetable enemies at any given point. 6 enemies bursting down, so burst fire, or what would be the burst DPS, burst a target down, TAC reload, burst the next target down, and do so for 6 targets. That's it, and I just average the DPS across all of those targets. Very, very simple. Now, as part of the burst DPS calculation that I do as part of that burst phase, I also include the first bullet principle. Now, although it's not very impactful for assault rifles, I bring this up now because it directly relates to the next principle that I'm going to explain to you, which has significantly more impact. But understanding this first bullet principle will allow you to understand that next principle much better. Here's an excerpt from my second video ever explaining the first bullet principle. Bullets per second. What you have here is a visual representation of 15 bullets striking in a single second. Each block made up of a bullet being fired and then hit, fired, hit, hit. so on and so forth. 15 hits in the second. What the firing range does, however, is it only starts calculating from the very first hit. That's when the second starts. So what we're actually seeing is a loss of that first bullet cycle, as it were, or more importantly, we're actually seeing the addition of another bullet in that first second. Now, the first bullet principle just simply states that the first bullet in the magazine, or that is technically in the chamber ready to be fired, doesn't need to be cycled. So in any period of time that the weapon is firing, that first bullet is like a free bullet as far as your rounds per minute is concerned. When you divide your rounds per minute by 60 to get the rounds per second, the rounds per second now includes the bullet cycle for that first bullet as well. But that first bullet fired starts at the 0 second mark, and that one bullet's worth of damage needs to be added and factored in as far as your DPS is concerned. Now, across an entire magazine, one bullet over 50 means that a burst DPS calculation will only be out by 2% if it ignores this. But if you are on a high damage build and you're taking down an enemy in potentially 5 bullets, that means a difference of 20% to your overall TTK, a massive margin of error. This principle genuinely has an effect on the burst DPS calculation. For an assault rifle, it's hard to notice, but if I give you an example, we just go for the basic table, base damage times rounds per second. The F2000 sits higher than the AKM on the burst DPS rankings, but the AKM has a higher per bullet damage. So at the 0 second mark, the AKM starts with an advantage. It starts at that 0 second because the bullet didn't need to be cycled. It starts at 67,227, whereas the F2000 starts at 45,132. From that moment onwards, the F2000 is outputting more damage per second, 676,980, versus the AKM's 672,270. But on the graph here, which is very hard to discern because they're so close in their burst DPS, but over the 4 seconds of firing until the F2000 runs out of bullets in a 60 round magazine, mind you, it still has not recovered from that deficit. I blow up the figures from the 4 second mark, you can see that the F2000 is still behind. So for the entire duration of the magazine, never is the F2000 ahead. So to say that the F2000 has a higher burst DPS than the AKM is completely incorrect. Every single time that those two weapons encounter enemies, RNG aside, the AKM 100% of the time will have a faster TTK. The margin of error that's in this calculation has already let you down. Even at the very basic level, it's already told you that one weapon is better than another, which is 100% incorrect. Now that's across an entire magazine. As the number of rounds required to kill a target gets less, the margin of error blows out. And when most builds at heroic level are going to take down an enemy in about 10 bullets, you can imagine how skewed any result that's produced by a burst DPS calculation can't be relied on. And certainly do not try to even attempt to use it for something like a shotgun or an MMR, because the calculation is completely useless, unless you simply account for the first bullet principle, in which case it's valid until the magazine runs out. It's pretty simple, but nobody can get on their soapbox and claim that a weapon is better than another one unless they account for that. And this is just one example. But let's move on to sustained DPS. Now, earlier on in the video, I said that it was a much better calculation for you to be able to learn about damage relationships, and I stand by that statement. But what I will also tell you is that it is horrifically wrong as far as calculating DPS is concerned for in-game play, and it directly relates to the same thing as the first bullet principle. This new principle that I'll introduce to you now is called the first magazine principle. If you're watching this channel, you are into the maths of this game, and this is it will change the way that you look at damage. So the sustained DPS calculation, total mag damage divided by time to fire the magazine and the time to reload. You will never complete doing the damage that you need to do in any given wave whilst reloading. You're always going to complete that damage whilst firing, meaning that in the same way that the first bullet cycle doesn't need to be counted, the last reload doesn't need to be counted. But if you look at it a different way, it looks exactly the same as the first bullet principle. If I just flip the terms below the line, what you have now is the time to reload plus the time to fire the magazine. The first magazine doesn't need to be reloaded. It's already with full rounds on the weapon, ready to go. And what that means is that a weapon with a higher total magazine damage starts with a significant advantage. It seems counterintuitive, but I'll give you a simple example. I have a blue weapon which has a total magazine damage of 3. 1 equals 1 enemy killed. So a total magazine damage of 3 enemy kills, basically. Total magazine damage 3. It takes 3 seconds to fire that magazine, and this weapon takes 3 seconds to reload. I have an orange weapon. Total magazine damage of 1. Time to fire the magazine, 1 second. Time to reload, 1 second. Now if I put the burst DPS calculation and the sustained DPS calculation here, burst DPS, total magazine damage over time to fire magazine. For the blue weapon, 3 over 3 seconds. DPS, 1. For the orange weapon, magazine damage 1, time to fire 1, DPS 1. Sustained DPS is 3 over 3 plus 3 for the blue weapon, being 3 over 6 or 0.5 DPS. For the orange weapon, it is 1 over 1 plus 1 or 1 over 2, being 0.5 DPS. By every metric that the community has used for the last 5 years at least, not including Division 1, these two weapons are identical as far as their damage output is concerned. But let me graph the results of their damage and their TTK. What you can see here in this very simple graph is that at no point is the orange weapon ever ahead, but a significant portion of the time to clear this wave, the blue weapon is in front. And to clear 6 enemies, the total time taken by the blue weapon is 22% faster. 22%. And it doesn't matter how many enemies I extend this out to, the blue weapon, 66% of the time, has a faster TTK. If I go back to the 6 enemy example, that difference in TTK, I would have to add to the orange weapon perfect spotter or perfect flatline to that weapon's burst DPS in order to achieve the same TTK for that wave. And if we take the average number of enemies in a heroic mission wave being 8, it would still require 12.5% amplified damage to the orange weapon's burst DPS in order to reach equality. So the problem for burst DPS, first bullet principle aside, is that it is only valid for the duration of the magazine. And when you're making a comparison, it is only valid for the duration of the shortest magazine duration. And in this case, it's only valid for 1 second. But for the next 2 seconds after that, the blue weapon with a larger total magazine damage and firing time is still killing things. And if we just take the first 3 enemies, at the 3rd enemy mark, the blue weapon, despite the metrics that everyone has used for the last 5 years, telling you that these weapons are exactly the same burst DPS and exactly the same sustained DPS, the difference in TTK for a 3 enemy scenario is 66%. So maybe now people might understand why I hung so much shit on the FAMAS fanboys, and why I take such offense to Reddit and Discord cowboys who spit venom at people based on their personal preference of weapon in-game, claiming that their 5% DPS from their FAMAS, or whatever it happens to be, is the best and there is no argument. This isn't hyperbole. A coin flip is a better predictor of which weapon will be faster to clear an enemy wave than your stupid 5% burst DPS. So my recommendation is dial back on the toxicity and pull your head in. Now, the only limiting factor to the first magazine principle and the advantage it provides is your ability to be able to dole out your full magazine. That comes down to your tactics, prioritization of enemies, and survivability, and that is something that I'm exploring in my Search for the Meta series. The problem for sustained DPS is the last reload. It will always assume that you're firing the full magazine and followed by a reload, and it will include that in every single calculation. One reload across a wave of enemies that is only an average of 8 enemies in number is a significant percentage of inaccuracy. So the bad news is that every single calculation that has been done over the last 5 years, and every single prediction veiled as fact that has used these equations, has been inaccurate. But the good news is that the solutions are very, very simple. All you have to do is set the amount of damage to be done in a burst firing situation. Just add 1 bullet's damage to the period of burst fire. If you want an accurate reflection of how your weapon's going to perform in-game, I suggest you add in tack reloads in between your targets. For sustained damage, again, just set the amount of damage to be done and just don't count the last reload. It's that simple. It's not pseudoscience, it's easy. And so that's what I do. So instead of sustained DPS, I have multi-target DPS. Same as the single target DPS, 6 targets, because that seemed like the logical number to use. And I just let the weapon fire for as long as it possibly can until it runs out of bullets, with a sustained reload in between. Continues on until all the enemies are down. That's it. Just disregards the last reload. That's not necessary. It's just simple maths. Now when you do that, for single target DPS, this is the results that you get. And the Ouroboros with a high burst DPS and a very short, as a matter of fact, the shortest of all of these weapon systems, tack reload, produces the highest amount of damage and the fastest time for clearing 6 enemies when we're taking them down individually. When we take this to sustained or multi-target DPS, it is still the Ouroboros that leads the pack, because again, its reload from empty is still the fastest that there is. So a combination of firing its entire magazine, even though it's a short duration, it is spending a shorter period of time in the downtime. But that shorter duration is counteracted by the longer duration of some of the other assault rifles, like, for instance, the 60-round Eagle Bearer and the 70-round St. Elmo's. Now, if I put these on top of each other with the same scaling, what you can see is that taking down enemies one at a time produces less damage per second than what taking down enemies using the full capability of the magazine does. Completely contrary to what our original spreadsheet produced, where our burst DPS amounted to almost double what we were doing for sustained DPS. And you will never ever achieve the results that burst DPS will tell you that you can get. Now in this video I'll put to bed the myth that we are always doing burst fire. As it turns out, we're roughly doing about 50% burst firing, where we will fire less than the full magazine, conduct a tack reload before going on to the next, and then 50% of the time we're doing sustained damage, where we're emptying the entire magazine, having to conduct a sustained reload or a reload from empty before moving on to the next thing. Now it varies from weapon to weapon depending on what your total magazine capacity is. So the only fair thing that I can do is to say that we are doing them exactly 50%. If we want the best average, then 50-50 split between single target DPS and multi-target DPS seems to be the best middle ground. So when we average both single target damage and multi-target damage, then this is the result. And you can still see that the Ouroboros is still in the lead. The St. Elmo's slightly pips the Eagle Bearer. And then we have some new entries up the top here. AUG, ACR, AKM, Military AKM, Capacitor, and the MK16 have a few percentage points lead on the rest of the pack. But the penultimate step is to combine our damage over distance with the damage produced by each one of these weapon systems. And to make it easier to understand how that works is we can flip the chart, and we're simply multiplying our DPS result by the damage percentage at different distances across the board. And what happens is when you do that, you get red is all of the exotics, blue is the 4-slot weapons, and orange being the 3-slot weapons. And you can see that there is very, very little difference across the suite of assault rifles if you weren't to consider the exotics. But on the whole, it is only the exotics that top this chart at any point across any distance. If I produce a chart with just the top 2 4-slot weapons and the top 2 3-slot weapons and compare those to all of the exotics, you can see that the only 2 weapons that ever appear on top of the chart are the Ouroboros for a short period at a short distance, and then it is the St. Elmo's that tops the chart for the entire duration. The top 2 4-slot weapons are the ACR and the MK16. The top 3-slot weapons are the AKM and the F2000. These are some of the surprises that I came across when doing all of these figures. Now, if we were to total all of the damage that these weapons produced across all of this distance, you get a chart that looks like this. But that is not a true representation of what occurs in-game because of the distribution of enemies across the battle space. So the very final step in working out what the most effective weapon is to combine our damage over distance with the occurrence rate of when or at what distance those engagements will occur. And if you look at the chart, you can see that it is this middle section of the chart where the majority of engagements will occur. And if I overlay those 2 charts together, you can see that it is this distance from 15 to 25 meters that is going to have the greatest impact on your damage output to your weapon. When we finalize that data, put it into a graph, we get this engagement weighted damage over distance. And then the very final step is to make this easy to read by totaling all of the damage across all of these distances with the engagements weighted accordingly. And what you end up with is a graph that looks like this. And what you can see is it is the St. Elmo's that has a comfortable margin over the rest of the chart. The surprises being the ACR and the MK16 as being the top performing non-exotic assault rifles. And what you can see here is that the Ouroboros appears in the middle of the pack. Now that's not to say that the Ouroboros is a bad weapon, because as we saw from previous charts, it has the highest amount of damage at close range. But using it as your primary weapon system, what you end up with is an average weapon. Now, as you can see also, I've got no talents have been considered in this chart. Now, after my last video, long-term subscriber Elf asked the valid question: with the buffs that have been applied to some of the weapon systems with Project Resolve, are those weapons with Flatline now an alternative to the St. Elmo's? Now, if you want to understand how all of the damage talents affect a 6 red core build, I have an entire series. I mean, some of the information is a little bit outdated now with TU20 changes, but the majority of it still stands. But if I go back to the chart and I show you what the maximum benefit that can possibly be applied from Flatline is, we can go to the Kingbreaker being 20% amplified damage. You end up with this, still short of the St. Elmo's. There are only 2 weapons that can realistically compete. The ACR, if I was to add 15% amplified damage from flatline onto the top, it would just exceed the damage of the St. Elmo's, but that's not accounting for the loss of 5% crit chance that comes with attaching a linked laser, and it does not include the damage that's added by the St. Elmo's Actum Est talent. As I've explained in previous videos, I believe it is one of the most powerful damage talents that are in the game. The only weapon that could realistically compete with the St. Elmo's for damage output is the Chameleon. If I add in 2 of the damage talents for the Chameleon, its damage spikes, and it spikes above that of the St. Elmo's, but you have to account for uptime when it comes to the Chameleon's talents. Now I'm going to leave that to you as to whether or not you are able to maintain 2 out of the 3 Chameleon's damage talents. But for me, the St. Elmo's is heads and shoulders above any other weapon, and it will remain my weapon of choice for the foreseeable future. Having said that, despite what this graph reflects as far as damage output is concerned, if I was to take a non-exotic weapon system, then my choice would not likely be the ACR or the MK16 or even the AUG. All 3 of those weapon systems have a relatively slow RPM. My choice would be directed towards the F2000, and that's because of other considerations, that primarily being the RPM of the F2000. 900 RPM. The majority of my run-around builds involve stacking talents, whether that be Heartbreakers, most likely Strikers, and for heroic content that is going to be in combination with another stacking talent being Obliterate. Despite the small deficit in overall damage output, the speed with which the F2000 will stack the damage for Strikers and Obliterate will very quickly eclipse the small margin of overall damage output that's reflected in this graph. But the other factor for a higher RPM weapon is overshoot, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can watch this video. But a higher RPM weapon will lose more of its total magazine damage to overshoot. So that is also something that is not factored into the chart. And also, outside of this graph, there is no reason as to why other weapon systems aren't going to dominate in other game modes. For instance, in PvP, burst damage becomes much more important. You are more often than not going to be facing one other player, and you are more than capable of taking down that player inside of one magazine. All of those factors point to burst DPS being the primary consideration for a PvP weapon system. The Ouroboros, that is its one and only strength. Having said that though, the capacitor, when you account for the fact that we have a large swing from health damage to armor damage when we're coming to PvP. Now that's a swing. We don't just add more damage to the capacitor, we also take off damage from the St. Elmo's. It's no longer getting the health damage that it's currently used to in PvE. This also applies in part to the incursion as well, where there's a much higher armor percentage to health percentage. The 21% multiplier that assault rifles enjoy is now taken away. And a weapon like the capacitor in PvP or in incursion actually improves its performance because the percentage of armor increases, whereas the assault rifles decrease, and a weapon system like the Ouroboros remains exactly the same regardless of the enemy type, with neither damage to health or damage to armor as a consideration. We also have the talent of the Eagle Bearer. That talent, the 80% reduction in damage, can quite easily see one person take out 4 players. If you were to reduce all of these damage figures by 80%, you can see how one player can possibly take out 4 players whilst that talent is active. So in PvP, St. Elmo's, Eagle Bearer, Capacitor, Ouroboros, and if you're a headshot god, even the Bighorn, all become viable weapon systems. Now this process that I've come up with, it's not perfect. I'm not claiming that it is. This is based on heroic engagements for the solo player. If you change any factor, then things start to shift from one direction to another, and we just saw that with PvP, some of the changes that occur there. It changes from control points to incursion, 2-man scaling, 3-man scaling, whether a wave has 8 enemies, 10 enemies, 18 enemies in Legendary. Legendary has a longer engagement distance. You are more likely to be firing sustained damage for more of the time. All of these factors will shift and ebb which weapon system is providing you the most benefit for your build and the situation that you're in. The most important factor is to understand what the strengths and the weaknesses of the weapon and in synergy with your build and how that works. But I think it's very clear from these results that the devs have made a concerted effort to ensure that exotic weapons remain at the peak of damage output. The problem becomes only choosing which exotic to have, but we do have 2 weapon slots. And maybe in a future episode, I'll look at the difference between maybe taking the ACR and the Ouroboros as your 2 weapons versus taking the St. Elmo's and potentially a shotgun. And if we're going to do that, we probably have to investigate potentially the F2000 and the Scorpio as your preferred combinations. But that's another day. If you enjoyed this one, hit the like button. If you want to see more, hit the subscribe button. Thank you for watching, thank you for subscribing, and I will see you in the next one. Log out.